Well, but first tonight, the claim against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh that he committed some kind of sexual assault while a student in high school has metastasized into something different, something ugly, and something threatening to all of us. We've learned remarkably little about Brett Kavanaugh or Christine Ford in the past week, despite a lot of words on their behalf. The facts of the case are still sparse and they're murky. But we've learned a disturbing amount about the left and what it's willing to do in order to maintain control of this country. Watch a clip from today in which New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand explained why she knows Brett Kavanaugh is guilty. Watch.
I believe her because she's telling the truth. She is asking the FBI to investigate her claims. She is asking for that kind of review, that investigative work, that oversight, that accountability, because she's telling the truth. Someone who is lying does not ask the FBI to investigate their claims. Who is not asking the FBI to investigate these claims? The White House. Judge Kavanaugh has not asked to have the FBI review these claims. Is that the reaction of an innocent person? It is not.
So try to ignore the yelling there and the theatrics and the pure demagoguery of the moment and focus instead on Kirsten Gillibrand's reasoning, to the extent that there is any. Quote, I believe her because she's telling the truth. Or put another way, it's true because it is. Now, in logic class, they call this circular reasoning, which isn't actually reasoning at all. Instead, it's simply a demand that you believe something because someone else is asserting it. Children talk this way. You'd think a U.S. senator would be embarrassed to. But it's the second part of Gillibrand's statement that you ought to pay attention to because it's scary. Kavanaugh hasn't called for yet another FBI investigation into himself. Therefore, Senator Gillibrand says he did it. Is that the reaction of an innocent person, she thunders? It is not. Well, not since the McCarthy era, almost 70 years ago, have lawmakers talked like this in this country. Unless you call for an FBI investigation of yourself, you're guilty of a crime. Even Joe McCarthy himself never said anything like that. It was too reckless even for him. And now one of the Democratic Party's leading presidential candidates casually drops the line at a press conference, and the media hardly notice. So apparently that's the new standard in Washington. Okay, well, let's start with Kirsten Gillibrand. Gillibrand was a friend of Harvey Weinstein's. Here's a picture of the two of them together. Weinstein has been credibly accused of rape. Did Kirsten Gillibrand know about Weinstein's sexual assaults? Was she an accessory to them? We've asked those questions before in this show, but we never got an answer. Why hasn't Gillibrand demanded an FBI investigation into herself to clear that up? Is that the reaction of an innocent person? By her standards, it's not. So bring on the FBI. Let them interview Kirsten Gillibrand under oath. Maybe surprise her at her home at dawn with a search warrant. And while they're at it, they should take a very close look at her relationship with Bill Clinton, another accused rapist. No doubt the Senate will beg for an investigation into that, too, assuming she's innocent. If she hesitates, press charges. This is lunatic. Sober liberals understand that it is. Democrats don't want Brett Kavanaugh on the court because they disagree with him. And that's understandable, by the way. They're angry that the Republican Senate refused to vote on Barack Obama's last Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland. That's understandable, too. But what's happening now is dangerous in a way that has nothing to do with politics. It's a threat to the civil liberties of every American, no matter who you voted for in 2016. Extremism has exploded on the left, and nobody is trying to contain it. Here's one particularly jarring example of that. This is Congressman John Garamendi of California. We know him well. He's one of the few House Democrats willing to come on this show. We don't usually agree with Garamendi, but we've always found him to be a decent and reasonable person, always. Here's what he just said about the Kavanaugh allegations.
Women across this nation should be outraged at what these white men senators are doing to this woman. The senators, the male senators who control that committee, are playing the game as old as an assault, and that is the woman's the accused. The woman is at fault.
Wait a second. What does the race of specific senators have to do with any of this? Should we be angry at them because of their skin color? Should we distrust them more? Are they inherently less fair or less decent because of the way they look? Garamendi is implying exactly that. So how is that different or better than anything George Wallace ever said? Well, it's not, except that suddenly this filth is everywhere, so you hardly even notice it. The last thing this country needs right now is more racial division. Democrats are pushing it anyway. They're using allegations that have literally nothing to do with race at all. But splitting the country into tiny warring groups is useful to them. It helps them maintain their power, and so they're happy to do it. Men against women, black against white, divide and conquer, whatever it takes. In the end, it's unlikely that we'll ever know conclusively what happened between Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Ford 36 years ago, if anything at all. But it's crystal clear what's happening right now. This is a power grab. It is hurting the country, destroying our centuries-old traditions of justice, and empowering morons and demagogues. We ought to shut it down right now. And yet, and this is late-breaking news, just seconds before airtime we learned that this may go on and on. Republicans on the Hill tonight are considering delaying the hearing scheduled for Monday. At this point, Brett Kavanaugh will be testifying by himself to some future date. Because of the rules of the Senate, that would push back the vote on Kavanaugh by at least a week, if not more, which is, of course, the whole point, to drag the country through this pointless charade, this circus which divides us and hurts us and degrades our standards of justice simply for political ends. That's where we are. Ian Samuel is a professor at Indiana University Law School, and he joins us tonight. Professor, I'm glad you're here as a law professor. I want to ask you about what Senator Gillibrand said today. She's a lawyer as well, I believe. And she said that the new standard is unless you call for an FBI investigation into yourself, you are by definition guilty. Is that a legal standard that you recognize?
Well, what I like to think about is if I were, as Brett Kavanaugh says, an innocent man, and if I were falsely accused of something this serious, what would I want? And I teach civil procedure and I think about criminal procedure, and as I think through that question, what I would want is a process that was regarded as so fair, even by my ideological adversaries, that I would live the rest of my life being able to point to the process and say, we had this out, and everyone can agree the way we did it was fair, and I was cleared. That's what I would want.
I would want that too, and I think we would both agree that the first thing you would want in that process is a full explanation of what the charges are from the person who's making them. And he hasn't received that. None of us have. But barring that, and I'm not attacking her, though I think all of us should be distressed that she's not explaining herself, but that's not what Gillibrand said. She said if you don't ask for an FBI investigation into yourself, that is an indication that you are guilty. And let me just suggest the obvious, which is that is insane. That is a third world standard. That is an un-American standard. And it's hard for me to believe that an elected U.S. senator would say something like that in public. You're not surprised by it, though.
Well, two things, actually, as to that. So, number one, if I were an innocent man, I would actually welcome the FBI investigating. I might not call for it, but I would say, sure, investigate. You will see that I am an innocent man. But the second thing, when I was listening to you talk about this, you said, and you pointed out, I think quite correctly, many of the senior members of the Democratic Party are credibly associated with important sexual predators like Harvey Weinstein.
Sure.
And I thought what you were going to say was it would be a good idea to investigate that, which I do agree with. And it seems like you're kind of going in the opposite direction. I don't really think of this as a partisan issue.
Well, of course, it's not a partisan issue. The point that I am making is that guilt by association is a low and immoral tactic, and we used to revile people who engaged in it, like Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin, and now it's so commonplace we don't notice it. And so the idea is if you've had dinner with somebody who has unsavory views or unpopular views, you can be fired, and we've seen people fired recently for that very thing. Guilt by association is not the same as guilt. And so to say that because Kirsten Gillibrand was friends with Harvey Weinstein, that she is somehow an accessory to his sexual predation is totally wrong. And I would never make that claim. I was merely saying that by the standard that she holds up.
I appreciate that.
What I'm suggesting is that she shouldn't say that innocent people have a moral obligation to call down upon themselves an FBI investigation. That's insane. Why doesn't anyone stop her and say...
I quite agree with that.
Yes.
But if I were an innocent man, I wouldn't think of it as my obligation, but rather my privilege. Well, I would insist. If I were Brett Kavanaugh, and if I were an innocent man, I would insist on pointing every camera on God's green earth in my face as I deny these allegations if I were an innocent man, truthfully. I want everyone to see it, wouldn't you?
I believe he's already done that. I think he's been the subject of 6 FBI investigations into his background checks by federal agents, and I believe he's testifying Monday, and he'll likely repeat what he's already said, which is, I don't know what she's talking about. I didn't do this. She, by contrast, who is the reason we're having this conversation in the first place, leveled a charge of felonious behavior against a public official and then has refused to explain herself. So where's the onus on her? She's dragged the whole country country into this and short-circuited a process the rest of us are vested in and not bothered to explain herself? I know you're not supposed to, like, attack the victim, but at some point, she's not in charge of this country. So why can't we ask her for the full story?
Well, I do think that as we say often in the law, the government is entitled to every person's evidence. And I do think it would be very useful if she would testify. But again, just to keep with the frame a little bit, if I were Brett Kavanaugh and if I were an innocent man, I would say, look, you don't want to testify on Monday, take a week, take 2 weeks, take a month. Because when this is done, and if I am confirmed, I will not live my life under a cloud where people can say, well, the reason you got through is because we rushed it. Take a month. This is my life. That's what I would do if I were an innocent man.
I understand, but then if you were facing opponents who publicly declared that you were guilty on the basis of no evidence and used as evidence the fact that you didn't request an FBI investigation into yourself, you would acknowledge you're dealing with unreasonable people who don't care about justice, who are merely trying to destroy your life for political ends, so maybe you'd behave differently, or am I being crazy here?
Well, I don't know about that. If I were facing unreasonable people, and if I were an innocent man, what I would say is, fine, you want to delay the hearing a month? Delay it. You want the FBI to look into it? Look into it. You want to interview this witness in closed session, in open session?
Anonymously.
I'm an innocent man.
Yeah, Yeah, I wish we lived in a country. I'd be happy to participate in such a system, but when you have people saying what Kirsten Gillibrand said today, or Congressman Garamendi said today, you're dealing with unreasonable people who don't care about justice, and it's scary. And I know that you believe that.
Prosecutors often don't, and that is why it would be important, I would think, in his position, to position yourself as a person who says, these people are unreasonable, and the way I will prove it to you is I will give them everything they want, and they will find
I think
nothing.
He's doing that Monday.
I'm an innocent man, if I were an innocent man.
I think that's the claim. Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, our long-term investigation into Google and its behavior and practices has borne fruit.